At my last press conference on July 28th, I promised to provide you with findings from the investigation into potential voter fraud as soon as possible. Based on the information uncovered during the course of this investigation, I'm here today to report my findings. There are approximately 972,000 eligible voters listed in Maine's central voter registration system. During the course of this investigation, I looked at less than 1% and found the following. Of all cases of potential voter fraud, including the 2010 investigation that resulted in 2 prosecutions, 84% were due to clerical error. 79% of these errors occurred on election day. Our investigative efforts were seriously hampered by the Maine law, which requires municipalities to only keep their voter history records for 2 years. While seeking that information would have been imperative to this investigation, only Portland still has a voter history from prior to 2007. Based on the information provided to me by a Bureau Motor Vehicle employee that non-citizens may have registered to vote, 6 non-citizens were confirmed to be on Maine's voter list. 1 non-citizen was proven to have cast a ballot in Portland in 2002. All of these non-citizens have either been deported or left the United States prior to this investigation. 77 students were found to be simultaneously registered in Maine as well as another state. 5 students have voted in both states in the same year, but not in the same election. Initially, the chairman of Maine's Republican Party, Charles Webster, presented me with a list of 206 students, all who have out-of-state addresses on file with the University of Maine system, some of which he believed voted twice in the same election and committed quote-unquote voter fraud. Based on the information provided on this list, I found that 2 of the names were found to be duplicates and therefore removed from the original list. An additional 77 names that Chairman Webster identified as only being registered in Maine were also removed from the list. This left 127 names to be fully investigated. Based on the limited information that Chairman Webster has access to, he believed some of these students voted twice in the same election or committed voter fraud. Upon further research by my office, our information indicated that 5 students voted both in Maine and another state in the same year. However, they did not vote in both places in the same election. 44 of the remaining students were found to be registered in Maine, but not their home state. 77 of the students were found to be actively registered to vote in both Maine and their home state. Being duly registered is a violation of law if the voter intentionally fails to disclose their previous address. It is impossible to determine if any of these students intentionally failed to disclose this information. I can say, however, that 11 of these 77 students left their previous registration address blank, and by law, these cards should have been rejected by the registrar as incomplete. Finally, there was 1 remaining case that we were unable to fully research since the student's home state did not respond to multiple requests and inquiries by my office. As Secretary of State, I also oversee the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, and am therefore responsible for the administration and enforcement of Maine's motor vehicle laws, Title 29A of the Maine Revised Statutes. Once someone registers to vote, they have made a declarative statement that Maine is their residence. Motor vehicle law requires those residents who are licensed to operate a motor vehicle to obtain a Maine driver's license within 30 days of becoming a resident. Additionally, if a resident owns a vehicle, they are required to register that vehicle in Maine and pay excise tax to the town in which they reside. Title 29A, Section 351, subsection 1A, states that an owner of a vehicle who becomes a resident of this state shall register that vehicle in this state within 30 days of establishing residency. 191 of the 204 students who claim Maine as their residence have yet to obtain a Maine driver's license, even though it has been far more than 30 days since they registered to vote. I have notified each of these students in this category of their responsibility as residents to adhere to these laws and asked them to take all appropriate actions to comply with Maine statute. Also, I previously informed you that I had received information from a Bureau of Motor Vehicle employee who was concerned that non-citizens may have registered to vote. This second investigation that I outlined on July 28th was based on this employee's experiences of accepting voter registration cards from customers she believed to be non-citizens, and as a chief elections official, I felt it my duty to investigate these claims. Based on the information brought forth by this employee, I consulted with the Attorney General and began researching any validity to these claims. Members of my staff and I met with agents from the Department of Homeland Security, Immigration, and Customs Enforcement, otherwise known as ICE, to ask for their assistance in confirming citizenship of any potential non-citizens who may appear on Maine's voter lists. Because this is a violation of Maine election law, ICE agents were able to assist, and we agreed to share any information uncovered during this process. To begin this process, my office looked at the history of identity requirements as they relate to obtaining a Maine driver's license or ID. Beginning in 1997, anyone who wished to obtain a Maine credential was required to provide a Social Security number to the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. When someone was not eligible to obtain a Social Security number, they were asked to provide documentation from the Social Security Administration stating that fact. When this documentation was presented in lieu of a number, a BNV employee entered a Social Security number of all nines in the required field and issued a driver's license or ID card as it relates to this investigation. The names and dates of birth of the individuals who were issued credentials using the Social Security number of all nines was cross-referenced with Maine's Central Voter Registration System. 26 exact matches were found. Upon initial review of citizenship status, 4 of those individuals were referred to ICE for follow-up. Subsequently, all 4 were confirmed to be non-citizens. 2 of the 4 registered voters submitted their applications through the Bureau of Motor Vehicles. 1 was a resident of Portland, and 1 was a resident of Southport. Both individuals checked that they were not citizens of the United States on their voter registration cards. Both of these registrations should have been rejected by the registrar based on their ineligibility to participate in Maine's elections. The third non-citizen registered to vote and was subsequently canceled on the same day. Attempting to register, the history and motivation of this person attempting to register to vote is not clear. The town clerk could not remember the circumstances surrounding the registration, and the registration card was no longer on file. ICE investigative records show he was a suspect involved in the transportation of illegal aliens to Maine to obtain driver's licenses. His current location is unknown. As to the 4th non-citizen who appears in Maine's Central Voter Registration System, there is no clear record as to how his name was added to CVR. There is a scanned copy of a Bureau of Motor Vehicle change of address card, but no voter registration card has been located. It cannot be determined if this voter registration card was lost or if the change of address card was mistakenly used by the registrar to create a voter ID in the Central Voter Registration System. Next, my office looked at previous investigations conducted by the Secretary of State's Office of Investigations that involved driver's license, ID theft, fraud, or misuse. These names and dates of birth were also cross-referenced with the CVR. 5 names were sent to ICE for citizenship confirmation. 1 was found to be a U.S. citizen, 3 were unable to be fully determined one way or the other, and 1 was found to be a non-citizen. The Portland City Registrar was able to confirm that this citizen of El Salvador registered and voted on Election Day in 2002. According to ICE records, this non-citizen was reportedly removed, deported, or excluded from the country in 2006. Then, based on an Associated Press article dated July 14, 2011, a 6th non-citizen was located in CVR, and that name was sent to ICE for follow-up. It was confirmed that he had been a legal permanent resident of this country, a citizen of Peru, who departed the United States in 2007. They have no record of his subsequent return, and the clerk from the town in which he previously resided confirmed he registered to vote in 2002, but had no record of him voting. In all, a sampling of 428 names of the roughly 972,000 eligible voters in the state of Maine, or in our CBR, were processed through this administrative investigation. That equals a sampling of approximately 0.04%. And based on that sampling, just over 1% of those registered voters were confirmed to be non-citizens. One of the 6 identified was confirmed to not only have registered, but also voted here in Maine. Also during the course of this investigation, we felt it necessary to refer a name and circumstances to the Attorney General for further investigation and possible prosecution. This research led me to seek a better understanding of where the weaknesses in our system are. In a report submitted to the legislature in March of this year summarizing the 2010 investigation of suspected voter fraud, it explained that prior to the implementation of the central voter registration system, there was no systematic way to look for instances of any of the 3 types of voter fraud. Dual voting was investigated when and if allegations were made either by elections officials or citizens of the various towns and cities in Maine. Since the implementation of CBR, we now have a computer database in which to locate possible dual voting. We rely on the accuracy of the information in CBR to accomplish this. The voter fraud report for 2010 explains that 1 person from each municipality has been trained and given access to the CBR in order to conduct their voter registration duties. Until after 2008's general election, municipalities did not consistently enter their voter participation history or the records of residents who voted in an election into the CBR. This lack of information makes it impossible to fully investigate previous voter fraud claims. We've heard a lot of numbers from this report and the claim that it shows there have only been 2 cases of voter fraud in Maine's history. What that report actually states is that there were 240 groupings of potential dual voting that affected approximately 500 voters. Of the 240 instances, 236, or 98%, were determined to be human error. Most notably, the errors were where the wrong voter was checked off on the incoming voter list on election day. 2 cases were prosecuted and convicted of dual voting. 1 case is still pending, and 1 instance of dual voting was not pursued for prosecution because that person who cast 2 separate ballots did not have the legally culpable state of mind. Further examination of the history of Maine's voting procedures provided me with some eye-opening information. Between the years of 1995 and 2010, 3 substantial federal election laws and 1 state law were implemented. First, the National Voter Registration Act, which among other things required the development of a program of systematic voter list maintenance. Second was the Help America Vote Act, which added a number of new intense voter system requirements in order to meet federal standards, including the creation of the central voter registration system. Third, the Military and Overseas Voter Empowerment Act, which requires each state to have at least 1 method of electronic communication used to provide absentee ballot applications, voter registration applications, and blank ballots, if requested, to uniform and overseas voters. In addition to these federal mandates, the state of Maine passed the Any Reason or No Reason absentee voting law, which became effective prior to the November 2000 election. The number of absentee ballots processed on average was 11% of the total ballots cast in 2000. This change in law increased that average to 32% of all voters casting absentee ballots in 2008. Each one of these mandates were passed with the singular purpose of increasing every American's access to the polls, no matter where they are in the world on election day. All of these changes have had a positive effect on civic participation. These changes have also had a significant effect on the duties of election officials up to and including election day. For example, my department has only 8 staff members who run all state and federal elections in Maine. The number of employees has not increased over time in correlation to the additional mandates. Their increased workload has, in turn, been passed on to and felt by each and every municipal clerk. We have asked more and more of our dedicated clerks and election officials without providing them the necessary time and tools to prosecute their jobs properly. During the course of this investigation, numerous people have approached me with concerns surrounding Maine elections. For example, the chairman of the Maine Republican Party asserted that 19 voters claiming their residence as the Holiday Inn Express in South Portland voted in 2004. These individuals, it was reported, were from the British Cayman Islands. Whether or not a violation of Maine's residency law has occurred has not yet been established. It was also brought to my attention that lawyers present at polling places on election day have badgered clerks into accepting voter registration cards they are unsure of and intimidating them to the point that they simply process the registration as is, without first calling the state election office for guidance. All of the findings from this small sampling have clearly shown that the integrity of our current system is vulnerable, and has confirmed my belief that our dedicated municipal election officials need some breathing room to ensure the accuracy of their work and protect the integrity and security of our elections in Maine. Finally, Maine's election system is long overdue for a comprehensive examination of our methodologies and ways in which we conduct our elections. Therefore, in the weeks and months ahead, I will continue to examine these processes and procedures in an effort to craft legislation that I believe that will secure our election process, and I will then submit it to the second session of the 125th legislature. With that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Hold on, guys. I guess
Run the battery on?
I do. Thank you.
Did any of the students actually commit voter fraud?
Well, I think it's pretty clear about what I said, that there were 77 students who were registered in both Maine and another state.
Is that fraud?
It is fraud if they intentionally did that. It's very, very difficult to prove that.
Are you going to try?
I think it'd be difficult to prove it, and I don't know that it would be prudent to proceed.
Is it a violation of law to vote in the same year in a different election as those five?
Well, technically, it's not a violation of the law. I'm not sure exactly how patriotic it is, but when people are moving from one state to the next state, and from one state to the next state like that, that's, we'll have to look further.
You were saying that you were going to be, you asked some of these students that had registered to vote in Maine to register their cars as well. Do you know that these students even have cars? I mean, when I was in college, I didn't have a car, so
well,
would have been.
What I've done, the 109, I believe it's 197 of those students, I've contacted them by mail, notifying them that the investigation in this matter is closed, and that if they intend to remain citizens of the state of Maine, that they are subject to Title 29A motor vehicle laws, and they should be aware of that, and they should take steps to correct any imbalance in their status within the law.
So you don't know whether they're, I mean, just because they don't have their car registered here doesn't mean they have a car, so that's
It doesn't mean they have a car. Again, as the person who administers Title 29A, it's my responsibility to let people know that once they register to vote, that according to the Attorney General, is a declarative action, declaring residency in the state, and at which time they become subject to the laws of the state.
In the investigation of the students and also the non-citizens, were you able to determine how many of them, if any, registered on election day?
Well, I think it's clear right there that 79% of the errors that were made occurred on election day. Of the non-citizens, the one that voted on, the one non-citizen that voted in 2002 did in fact register on election day. And I really want to point out two things. The small size of this sample and the difficulty in investigating this, because voter registration records are only kept for 2 years by the towns and cities. We were very fortunate the city of Portland did have the 2002 records. This is a very long process. We have a very small staff here, and we're only able to thoroughly research just less than 500 individuals in this process, which is less than 1% in the state of Maine.
So given that you're only looking at a small sample and obviously many of the names in that sample already there was suspicion about them, do you think that this is an accurate representation of the amount of voter fraud, potential voter fraud in the state, or do you think that there's so far to go you can't really say what's going to
Well, I think it's very difficult to tell, but I think what it does show is Maine's system is incredibly vulnerable, incredibly vulnerable in the case of registration, the credentials that are required for registration. If you look at the voter registration cards, which I believe are public record, hundreds of them are not completely filled out. They should not have been accepted by the registrars. There are hundreds and hundreds of mistakes that are being made both before and the majority on election day.
Charlie, could you talk a little bit about the case that's been referred to the Attorney General for criminal possible criminal prosecution? Well, can you say whether or not is this a case involving a student, or is it an immigration type issue, or?
It's not an immigration issue.
In your first press conference, you mentioned that the worker who had come to you about being concerned about non-citizens registering to vote, that they had also discussed documents getting destroyed. Any comment on that?
That part of the investigation is still in the hands of the Attorney General.
Let me get this right, Charlie. We went through 500, we found one to refer to the Attorney General.
Not the 500 that I went through were people who were suspected of obtaining either driver's license or IDs or part of what Charlie Webster brought through. The individual that dealt with what I really can't get into was someone that this office was aware of prior to, and that was then put to the Attorney General.
So out of the 500, none are being referred to the Attorney General for further investigation or possible prosecution.
None are being referred to the Attorney General primarily because in the case of the non-citizens, they are no longer in the country.
So that suggests that the system kind of figured itself out. I mean, you're making it seem like it needs a massive overhaul, but it doesn't sound like that's the case.
Is that your opinion, or is it
Well, no,
a fact? Or?
Well, judging by what you presented, it doesn't seem like a widespread problem. Here's the thing: if human error is always going to exist as long as humans are involved, like how much human error can you get rid of?
Well, all I can say to that is I think the Supreme Court several years ago decided that there's one vote for one person. And if you think of the debate that went on in the legislature this last session over LD 1376, I think that the Democratic lead on the Legal Affairs Committee said it best, Senator John Patrick, when he said if one Democrat, one Republican, or one independent is disenfranchised, that's too many. And right now we have concrete evidence that there has been disenfranchisement here by the voting of a non-citizen. We have concrete evidence that non-citizens are in fact on our voting rolls. And if we had access to voter history of all the towns and cities, which, by the way, is something I will recommend to the legislature, those records are retained for a longer period of time, then we could answer your questions. But I think that just by the small sampling, it gives you a pretty good flavor of some of the issues that are facing the clerks, some of the issues that are facing my staff, and essentially, I think we're at a point where the system is very overheated, and we're trying to put 10 gallons into a 1 gallon bucket. And if you think about this, we are still operating in Maine on an 1820 model when it comes to our elections. Yet this is 2011, when technology has enabled interest groups on every side of every issue to motivate large numbers of people to register and vote, which is a very, very good thing. However, when my election staff has not increased, when the town's budgets have decreased, when you see the number of mistakes, clerical errors that are happening on election day, I think it argues fairly clearly that this system is in need of an overhaul. I look back to our records, I haven't seen any comprehensive review of the way we do business. I can't think of one private industry group that does it on a yearly basis. In fact, when I was in the legislature in 1990, I remember Governor McCartney going through the TQM, the Total Quality Management, and looking at the way we do things and the way our best practices and the things where we're falling short. And I think that as a chief election official, that it's incumbent upon me to look at what works and to make recommendations on how to fix those things. And that's really where I think this investigation leads us to this point, that there are serious issues facing our election system, and it's imperative on this legislature to lean forward and try and do things to head off any potential problems.
Is your contention, given that most of these, all the clerical errors that are being made on election day, are you arguing there that by eliminating same-day voter registration, you are going to prevent that because clerks have more time? I mean, was that?
That's been my position all along on LD 1376. I feel strongly a 48-hour period for clerks to prepare themselves was arguably the most important thing we do in our society is a very, very reasonable, moderate step. And when you consider 41 other states already require people to register anywhere from 15 to 30 days prior to an election, No, I think it's a reasonable, moderate step.
And is it, oh, sorry, but I was just gonna say, and so therefore this is sort of backing, you feel this backs up your
I do.
feeling?
Charlie, the Maine Town and City Clerks Association, as you know, is on record as saying that they support same-day voter registration. So are you today telling them that they need, that you're going to give them help that they neither ask for nor
I
support?
think you need to really go back and remember the hearing there, because the clerks testified in support of LD 1376.
Right.
And what they said was, under question, if you want to amend now election day registration, we're fine with that too.
Since then, they've stated quite publicly their support for same-day registration.
Some clerks,
They don't-
yes.
I've yet to hear a clerk say he or she needs your help.
I feel very strongly that based on what I've laid out here today, that we have a situation in the state of Maine that if we don't try to modernize our election practices and procedures, we will eventually lead us down a road where something breaks down. And if that were to happen, and I did not try to lean forward on that, then Bill, you would be asking me, why didn't you do something about it? And, that's the way I view it, and that's the way I call it.
Charlie, have you done any comparisons to other states and their election systems, both for a number of cases of fraud and also how their systems work, and whether or not you can pull from any of those other states for ideas on how to overhaul the system?
I think it's a good question, and I'll answer it two ways in talking with my colleagues at the National Association of Secretaries of State and trying to determine best practices. And in fact, I have a meeting coming up in Georgia next month. That will be one of the things that we do. But again, I point back to the fact that Julie Flynn's staff, my election staff, is 8 people right now. The towns and cities have not increased the size of their staff, and we are essentially operating on an 1820 model.
Besides supporting 1376, and it sounds like adding more staff and resources, are there other recommendations that you can think of right now that are going to be trying to solve whatever it is the problem that you've seen?
Well, again, I think a good first step would be to provide the clerks just 2 days.
Right, so supporting-
prepare themselves,
yeah.
prepare themselves for the election. I think that's a very moderate step. Beyond that, I think we have to look at record retention, like I mentioned.
Yeah.
I strongly believe that Maine needs to come up with one definition of residency. There are about a dozen definitions in the statute of residency as it pertains to voting, as it pertains to motor vehicle, as it pertains to this, as it pertains to that. I think we need to have one definition of residency in the state. That would probably clear up a lot.
Do other states do that?
I can't answer that.
Secretary, did you send a memo to the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee this session that said our voting system has met the demand of increased same-day registration, and we have protected the integrity and accuracy of our election system?
Would that be on January 12th of 2000?
I don't have the date. It's a text message.
Well, I'm sure it is a text message. And I'm glad they sent it to you, because I'm happy to once again clarify that. I signed what was a perfunctory letter at the time, 6 days after I became Secretary of State. That investigation was actually done by my predecessor, and I was forwarding it on as I was required to under statute. Since that time, there are obviously been other issues.
What would you like to see the definition of residency in the state of Maine be?
What would I like to see it be? I'd like to see it be clear.
But you said you wanted to have one. I mean, have you gotten that far? I mean,
No, because I think it's very difficult. Again, there are several definitions under Title 21A, residency, and let's use the example of Charlie Webster uses of the 19 students from the Cayman Islands that were up as part of a reciprocal agreement with St. Joseph's College. Title 21A clearly states that residency means that you have a permanent home in Maine and you intend to return there after periods of absence. I would question whether or not those individuals ever would have come to Maine had there not been a rainstorm in the islands. And I do question whether or not they ever intended to return to the state of Maine. Those are some of the ambiguities in the law as it pertains to residency.
As the law now stands, though, aren't those questions irrelevant to their right to vote in that election in May?
To their right to vote?
Yeah,
I think
as American citizens.
As American citizens, they're free to vote by absentee, and had they not left the Cayman Islands, which is a British holding, they would have been voting by absentee in the Cayman Islands. Maine law clearly says that an individual has to be willing and state that they will return after periods of absence. when someone knowingly signs that oath and knowing that they will not be returning to the state, I think it throws it into question.
But you're not saying today that those people voted illegally.
I'm saying it throws it into question. Anyone else? No, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Secretary.